each week on Substack and podcast, The Female Body Politic. Tonight's author unpacks today's headlines through the lens of 250 years of women's political power in America. She's published 2 books about such women. First, The First to the Front, The Untold Story of Dickie Chappelle, trailblazing female war correspondent, and now Winning the Earthquake about Jeanette Rankin. But we are so pleased. She's always been a great supporter of independent bookstores, especially ours. She and Leslie Zemeckis are doing the Santa Barbara Literary Festival coming up when?
May 2nd and 3rd, 2026. Tickets on sale next week.
The first ever. So we hope to see you all there. But her and Josh's tireless support of the literary world, of the local literary world, is greatly appreciated. And we are so pleased to bring Lorissa Rinehart to Chaucer's.
Let's get started, and thank you for not asking what my conversation was with the governor. I would like to say I don't remember, which is probably true. But I do want to thank you for asking me to be part of this. I actually am usually the one getting interviewed. But I realize there's an enormous amount of work that goes into asking the right questions. And when we met, I asked you, is there anything you'd like me to ask? And you said, I want you to be sort of the voice of the people, or ask the questions that you think the people in the audience might like to hear. So I'm going to do my best to channel all of you, but I have to admit I do have a few questions of my own. And I think, though, they're questions that you also would want to ask. Do a little bit or do a lot about this incredible woman, and then talk about some of the similarities to what's going on in today's world. And I think that that's all relevant as we drove over here, listened to the news. It's just so mind-boggling. And yet some things never change. History tends to repeat itself. So let's start off a little bit with your background. You are a San Marcos High School graduate. Go Royals!
Yes.
All right. You went on to get your BA from UC Santa Cruz, so you're also a banana slug.
Yep.
I know. We have one in the family as well. And you got your master's degree at NYU in experimental humanities. So how did you get into the writing profession, and what attracted you to be writing about female subjects? The first book, which I also implore all of you to take a look at, it's The Untold Story of Dickie Chappelle, who was one of the first women photojournalists who actually lost her life, was killed in Vietnam. Some of us old folks remember that era, trying to document what happened and what was going on in that war. But you did. So this book is about Jeanette Rankin, another quite astonishing woman. What got you attracted to writing, and what got you attracted to these women, to writing about strong women?
Yeah. So I always wanted to be a writer, ever since I was quite young. And actually, Tim Dewar in the back was my English teacher, and he really taught me the love of writing. So I'm always grateful. Thank you. And you know what attracted me to writing about strong women, in particular, I think really. That's okay. I have kids. I'm used to it. Really came about in 2016 with the first election of Donald Trump, quite frankly. Because at the time I was working in the arts, I was a curator, and I liked my job. But am I talking too loud or not loud enough? No. Good. Okay. But it wasn't like my passion and purpose in life, right? And when he was elected, I realized that it was a moment that demanded we all be our best and biggest selves. And for me, that was taking the leap of writing. And so I quit my job as a curator. I got sort of a 9-to-5, and I went back to school for experimental humanities and at NYU, and I just started writing about anything and everything for anyone who would publish my work, for nothing at first. And again, I was drawn to writing about women because women, of course, have been so erased in history, and yet have made so many contributions to history. And it really relates to this book because Jeanette Rankin believed that women were the untapped superpower of America, right? And that it was only through allowing them to know their past and achieve their goals that we could have a more perfect union. And I didn't know that at the time, but I felt that was true as well. And it just became an obsession of mine, and luckily it turned into a career.
Well, so in looking at these two women and others that you may have researched, do you see any theme? Do they share anything in common? And what are the qualities that you saw in them that you think are similar or that led to their sense of accomplishment, leadership, fortitude in a world that wasn't necessarily that open to them?
Yeah, you know, both Jeanette and Dickie had a really unshakable sense of purpose. I don't want to say it was an unshakable sense of self, because they had a, hi honey, because they had a lot of self-doubt, right? They didn't always know they were on the right path, but they knew what they were put on this earth to do, and there was nothing that could get them off that path. And they had the courage to pursue that. So I think, you know, it's about allowing yourself to find your passion and purpose in life, which these two women did. And also I just want to say, you don't know what was true about both of them is that they didn't find that right away. It took a long time for them to come to that conclusion and to reach like the fullness of their self and their purpose.
So when you started writing about Jeanette Rankin, did you have any preconceived notions about her? How did you go about deciding to write about her? You talk about people erased from history, and she was pretty much erased until you read the book and realize how extraordinary she was. But a lot of people didn't know about her. As you started, did you have any ideas about who she was, what she was? How did that process start?
Yeah, so, you know, I really came to this book by happenstance, but it was, you know, a felicitous happenstance, because after my first book, my publisher was like, okay, give us 5 ideas for your next project. You know, we'd like it to be about a strong American political woman. And I gave them 5. Please don't ask me who the other 4 were. I don't remember. And, you know, so I wrote a sort of 1-page pitch on Jeanette, and she was interesting, definitely. And I hoped that they picked her, but I was willing to sort of write about all of them. But they came back within, I think, 2 or 3 weeks, and they said, great, you know, we'll commission you to write this book, which is rather unusual for the publishing world. So I was like, okay, let's go. But the more I dove into her story, the more it became a necessity for me to write it correctly. And it was actually an interesting process, because with Dickie, you know, I had known about her for a long time. I had known about her since I was a kid. Like I won't go into it, but I knew about her since I was working at Roma, for those of you who remember Roma downtown. And, you know, with Jeanette, so with Dickie, I would research a chapter and write a chapter, and research a chapter and write a chapter, because I kind of knew the story. With Jeanette, I just read for 6 months, and I did not feel that I could write anything. And so I would go into our little garden shed, which is, you know, has drywall and like a hole in it for an extension cord. Yeah, that's my writing studio. It's great. It's really lovely. And I just could not write anything for 6 months, and I just read everything she had ever written and said, and everything ever written and said about her, until one day I just sort of knew it was time, and I started to write, and it really just flowed out of me in a way that I did not expect. And as you alluded to earlier, the parallels between what she confronted and overcame, and you know, the sort of 19 teens Montana in particular, and America at large, and what we are confronting now are just uncanny.
So we will get to that.
Yeah.
And you mentioned in writing this biography, you did an enormous amount of research.
Yes.
With over 820 footnotes Actually, 823 to
Yes.
be exact.
I remember them
Whoa.
all.
So you mentioned that most of her personal records, so, had been lost, either because they were distributed willy-nilly and no one had any account of them, or they were lost in the fire at her home. So you talked about how you were able to get that information, including the use of artificial intelligence. Would you share that with us? Because I think that's both fascinating and creepy. So tell us a little about how that works.
Well, so I'll start with the AI because I think there's a lot creepier uses of it. But so in the late 60s, a gentleman by the name of Ted Harris, whose grandsons I was grateful to meet, spent hours at Jeanette's house, like over the course of 2 years, asking her about her life, and he recorded it all. And it was recently digitized by the University of Georgia. And they sent it to me, but it's impossible, right, to listen to all of this, especially with contemporary publishing deadlines. I had a year. I don't have hundreds of hours to listen to all these oral histories. So I used AI to transcribe them, and then I was able to read through them, go back to the timestamp to listen to exactly what she had said if it was particularly relevant, and then include those in the writing, because what I really wanted to do was incorporate her point of view and her voice into the book, both so it was intimate and urgent. And then in addition, I was very fortunate to work with a number of graduate students at various institutions. Her collections are in 5 different institutions around the country. It's impossible to travel to all of them. And so they just digitized them on their phones and uploaded them to a shared Google Drive. And because of that, I was also able to spend a lot of time with those materials. Like when you go into an archive, right, you have to take notes on the side, and you obviously can't take them home with you, and you have limited time, and you can only go at certain times. But because of this, I was able to really just imbibe them entirely. And then the last piece of the way I was able to write this, and the reason there are so many citations, is newspapers.com. If you're a researcher, it's an amazing resource. They've digitized 150 years of American local newspapers. Again, this relates to what we're going through now. But I was able to really get a greater understanding of how relevant Jeanette was in the political landscape at the time. Because what's really forgotten is that when she was elected in 1916 and when she served in Congress in 1917, she was the most famous woman in America, sort of by far. And I was able to bring that sort of sense of ubiquity and fame, right, to the book and talking about what she accomplished.
So she was born and raised in what was then the pretty rugged Wild West of Montana, which is a very interesting state in that it has really supported and promoted a lot of women's rights over the course of time. Women, I suspect, were expected to get out there in the plains and the frontier and do the work that needed to be done. Did any of that, do you think, contribute, in your opinion, to her personality or character and her subsequent successes or failures?
Absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned, right, there was a greater degree of gender equality in Montana than you would necessarily find on the East Coast at the time, right? Because if you're alone on a homestead and your wife is giving birth, you both have to witness that birth and participate in the birth. And you can't ignore the fact that it's hard. And you also have to, be there for the child and the mother. The same way, when it's harvest time and there are only so many hands, you have to, as a woman, have to bring in the harvest. So there was a sense that everyone's labor was seen and everyone's labor was appreciated far more than in structured hierarchies, gendered hierarchies that you had on the East Coast. So that really gave her a sense of personal equality. And then it also, I think, just the fact that she was used to talking to ranch hands and lumberjacks and miners as a child and then as a young woman, really gave her a leg up in politics because she was both tough but also able to talk to all different kinds of people with a great deal of ease.
And of course, when you mentioned that, I think one of the things was interesting. Her father was a very successful landowner and all, and had a lot of ranch hands. And she insisted, did she not, that they be paid more fairly.
Yes.
So she took on Dad right at the beginning and said, "You're not paying these people enough."
That's right.
And of course, that was something that she followed up on in her career. Was there any reason that you can think that she had that sense of fairness and that sense of rights of working people, because that was something that was very much her?
Yeah, I think part of it was just the way she was born. I mean, she's such an American mythological figure, right? Like, she would read the Constitution and the Bill of Rights by candlelight as a child, you know, like, who does that? She did. But then also, I think, you know, she was the oldest daughter of 6 siblings, and as a lot of oldest daughters at that time, she became the second mother, right? And so she was very much involved in, you know, litigating her siblings' squabbles and making peace in this way and having to see everyone's point of view. And I think she carried that with her into politics in a way that expressed itself in a myriad of ways, but one of them was her dedication to workers' rights. But I just also think that's who she was. And the final piece of that was, you know, she was, right, this is Montana in the 1890s into the early 1900s, and you still at that time had, you know, genocide, to not mince words, being committed against the indigenous peoples there, and she witnessed that. And she had a very clear sense as a young girl that this was morally reprehensible and could not stand. And that was really seared into her consciousness, particularly if we want to skip ahead quickly, but, you know, in the way that she compared what was being done in Vietnam to the people there, to what had been done to the indigenous people in Montana at the time when she was growing up.
So let's go back though to these qualities. I mean, she was the first woman ever elected to the United States Congress. This is extraordinary. Back in, what was it, 1917?
Yeah, she was elected in 1916, served 1917.
So she was, what, 35, 36 years of age?
Yes.
She was born in 1880, and she lived a long life, died in
1973.
So what, 93 years.
Yeah, 93 years old.
And was active until the end. We'll get to that.
Yes.
Because we still have a lot of the middle to take. So how was she able to pull off the almost impossible to become the first woman ever to elected to Congress? You mentioned some of her qualities, but how did she go about doing this?
So you mentioned that her father was a landowner, but what her father really was a self-taught engineer. And he built the first bridges of Missoula. And this has a point, trust me. So if you know Missoula, it is a city surrounded by rivers. So it's really an island among rivers. Jeanette, I believe, inherited his engineer's mind. But rather than bridges, she built political machines. And so she was really able to see the ways in which political machines were built, how they functioned, and how if you had one piece, you could change everything. And so, you know, before she got elected, she really spearheaded the suffrage movement in Montana. She had already been working for the National Association of Women's Suffrage on the national level and on state levels. And then she took that knowledge and then applied her really unique sense of grassroots organizing to that. And so basically, I think it's really interesting what she did because it bears relevance to today. So Montana, as you can imagine, is a huge state, and there wasn't a lot of, you know, modes of conveyance at the time. There weren't planes, there were hardly cars, and so she had to really find precinct captains, right, in every area of Montana and say to them, I trust you to organize your community and to talk to your community in the way that you think is most advantageous. If you have questions, I will answer them, but I'm not going to tell you what to do. And in this way, she was really able to build a constellation of power very quickly, of autonomous power that could act at a moment's notice and that didn't require instruction. So, right, she gave a speech in favor of suffrage on the Montana State Legislature in 1911. She was basically left, you know, off stage. 2 years later, she flipped both houses to being almost unanimously for women's suffrage, and then the following year, when it was on the ballot, it was passed. She then took that political machine that she had built and pushed it toward her own congressional campaign. And it was because of, both her long game, starting back in 1911 and even before that, but also because of her knowledge that grassroots democracy can create rapid progressive change, that she was able to get elected.
We'll get to her sense of democracy as well, because some of it sounds familiar. But once she got to Congress, her first bill, if I'm not mistaken, was the Susan B. Anthony Right to Vote legislation.
Yes.
And tell us how she was able to work the legislation to fruition. It's a great story about the art of politics.
Yeah.
It reminds me a little of how LBJ, if you read Robert Cano's book, Master of the Senate, how after JFK was killed, he was able to get the Civil Rights Act passed. I mean, I thought of that, and I thought of the work that she did. What did she do? How did she go about doing this?
So I think there were two really pivotal moments, in addition to 1,000 hours of getting this through. But the first moment came when you introduce a bill and you have a committee in Congress to get the bill through, and the committee nominated her to be the head of the committee. And she realized that not only was she a woman and the only woman in Congress, but she was also a freshman Congresswoman person. And that freshman Congress people don't lead committees. And that if she were to take this position, it would be seen as, she was being overly ambitious and an upstart and narcissistic. So rather than take the chairmanship, she suggested that another member of the Democratic Party, she was actually a Republican, that he be chairman of the committee, because he had been working on women's suffrage for so long and didn't want to steal his thunder. And this alone bought her a great deal of goodwill in the Congress, right? Not only because she was seen as selfless and not craving the limelight, but also because it was recognized that she knew what she was doing. And then the second really big piece, which was one of my favorite, and I'm so sorry, maybe you remember his name because you've probably read the book more recently than I have, but there was a congressman, and he was the one who coined the term iron-jawed angels, right? Like, he hated suffrage. He did not think women deserved the right to vote, let alone wear pants, and she would not sit in his sight line for fear she would enrage him. But she went to his district to campaign for suffrage. And rather than sort of berate or tear him down, she said what a great congressman was, he was, and how wonderful things he was doing for their district, but that they should tell him to vote for women's suffrage because, that would make him an even better congressperson. So this impressed him enough because he expected to hear bad things. The second thing she did was on the day of the vote, she went to his office, and he was a great orator. He was very persuasive. And she said to him, "I'm not asking you to vote for suffrage. I'm just asking you not to make a speech because you are so persuasive." And having, knowing that she had turned down the chairmanship and knowing that she had gone to his district and been positive about him, he agreed. And what was actually extraordinary was, in Congress, the roll is called twice, and you are allowed to change your vote. And on the second roll call, he went down to the table where the changed votes are recorded, and he told everyone that came up that if he changed his vote, that this guy would change his own vote. And so in this way, the 19th Amendment, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, passed Congress the year she was in office.
So she was actually able to make a friend out of an enemy.
Yeah, without changing sides of the aisle.
Without changing it.
Yeah.
So, all right. Interesting issue. I'm not sure. I think many of us are wondering whether that could happen today or not. But there seem to be so many parallels to her time and today. Powerful companies, corporations controlling the economies, the politics, and the working people within those places. Could you share some of those parallels with us and the role they played? For example, there was something called the Anaconda Copper Company.
Yeah.
It was a company town. They controlled the politics of Montana,
Yeah.
sort of like Elon Musk or Facebook and all of these major autocrats. Today, I don't think you call them that in the book, but
I definitely called them oligarchs.
oligarchs.
Yeah.
There you go. All right. Well, with that in mind, can you sort of describe what she experienced and how similar that is, and then also after you do that, I want you to read that paragraph.
Oh, okay.
in the book, if you would. So tell us how things were very similar as she went ahead, and she wasn't just a single issue person. She
Yeah.
got the right to vote passed and did a whole bunch of other things. But tell us how things were rather similar to what we've been experiencing today.
Yeah, so Anaconda Copper Mining Company was an unofficial subsidiary of Rockefeller, of Standard Oil. It was like his brother and a cousin or something like that. And they had basically cornered the copper market in Montana. They owned all of the mining interests, which is basically Montana's economy. And then at the time, right, the power grid wasn't sort of centralized. It was every city had a company that had a power grid. Refining copper takes a lot of electricity, and so Anaconda Copper bought Montana's power grid. So it owned all of its power. And then they proceeded to purchase almost every single newspaper with the exception of one that was circulated statewide. Right? In addition, they bribed nearly every member of the state legislature to do, what they wanted and act in their own best interests, in addition to the judiciary. And it was to the degree that on the first day of every legislative session, that there was a sort of party, like a bar crawl, paid for by Anaconda down Last Chance Gulch, which is Helena's main street. So every bar and every brothel was available to the state legislatures. And there was nothing that they did not control or touch in Montana. But people were really fed up with it. They knew that they were being squeezed. They knew that they were being not paid a living wage, that their sort of labor and their wealth was being extracted from them. And they were sick of it. And there was a great deal of momentum towards progressivism at the time. But then Jeanette was also able to capitalize on this, even though she was shut out of newspaper coverage to a large degree, and even though Anaconda Copper actually tried to tamper with the vote when it came down to it. We can get into that, how they did that. Very specifically and intentionally and obviously. But she ran a positive campaign, and I am going to get into the weeds a little bit because I think this is, important. But Montana at the time was known as an open state, which meant that everyone in the state was able to vote on both of their Congress members. And so Jeanette would be able to go into every city and town and, homesteader community and say, vote for your local man and vote for Jeanette Rankin. And she never had to run a negative campaign. And it also wasn't a zero-sum game, right? It wasn't, if you vote for me, you're taking away your vote from your other guy. You're voting for your local guy that you like and for me. And I like your local guy and we share a lot in common. So it's additive rather than subtractive. And because of this, and she ran under the slogan, let the people know, which I love, she was able to come in second and therefore be elected to Congress. And I hope I don't step on you, but right after she was elected, Anaconda Copper went to the state legislature and told them to gerrymander her out of her district. And so she did not run for a second term.
Well, having been gerrymandered once myself, I can relate to that. But clearly, from what you're saying, people got tired of this kind of abuse. So, having worked on this measure before she decided not to run again, I mean, she was not a single issue candidate or Congress member. She authored the maternal care bill with Congressman Robinson.
Yep.
to assure both pre and postnatal care for new mothers. What a notion.
And yeah, right. And it's again uncanny because this was the first bill that would give federal funds to women's health at all. And she's from a rural district, and she saw so many mothers and children dying. And now we are faced again with the closures of rural health clinics.
Yes, and she also fought for workers' rights.
Yes.
She was a big union person. She fought to get rid of the Electoral College.
Wow.
And fought for this rank-based voting,
Yeah.
which of course is also something that's happening now. Can you tell us a little about what those efforts were and how they ended up? Obviously, they didn't succeed, but what did that? How she fought for them, and what ultimately was the cause of her inability to move those forward?
Well, I mean, I'll start with the second question first. And the reason that she wasn't able to move those forward is because those measures, ranked choice voting, multiple member congressional districts, and abolishing the Electoral College benefit the people, not the people in power. And even if they were progressive or sort of pretended to progressivism, they didn't want to lose their seat in power. And, you know, it's very difficult to get people in power to even talk about these issues. Like Jamie Raskin just co-sponsored a bill with Carl Beyer, who blew up my book, about ranked choice voting. But it's very difficult now and then to get people in power to even talk about these. So she was really scuttled, I think, by the lack of the capacity to communicate these issues on a national level. But she did her best. And really starting in 1912, she talked about these issues on the suffrage trails. She talked about them in her own campaign. And then later in life, she returned to advocating for these, particularly in Georgia, where she spent her later years, hoping that it would be a test case, particularly when Jimmy Carter was coming up in the ranks. But still, she didn't make a great deal of inroads, and yet I think it's incredibly important. Even when we don't see a lot of progress, Jeanette is an amazing example of this. It's important to try because someone has to be the first one to break the ground. And that's what she did.
And she didn't stop there. I mean,
No.
she was a founding member, if I'm not mistaken, of the ACLU.
Yep.
She wrote and supported the need for government-funded news services to combat corporate control of newspapers.
In 1918.
The precursors to NPR and PBS, which of course are at risk right now. She was there out front. She was an active member of the National Consumer League, fighting for food safety, worker protections, and the 10-hour workday. Because obviously it was, so I mean, she was way ahead of her time.
Yes.
And I might say as a Republican. So we could get into what happened, but we won't. Because I want to talk about the two very significant positions and votes that she took that seem to have been the most impactful, I think is the word, on both her personal and political life.
Yeah.
One being her speech on the floor, in which she employed an arguably a racist approach to ensure the votes for the passage of women's suffrage, and the other being her absolute and unwavering commitment to pacifism. So let's take them one at a time.
Okay.
Start with her speech on the floor, and this is someone who's a recovering politician. I can appreciate the angst that she must have experienced in the decision she made when it came to getting women's suffrage passed in Congress.
Yeah, so I think the sort of open, dirty secret of suffrage is that it was incredibly racist.
Yes.
And that a lot of the rhetoric and reasoning behind it was based on giving white women the right to vote would disenfranchise black people. And there's no mincing words on that, or changing it, or whitewashing it. And Jeanette employed that rhetoric in her speech in Congress and lobbying for the passage of suffrage through Congress in 1918. And you can't change that. and you can't excuse that, and it has to be talked about and acknowledged. What is also interesting to me is that after the war and after her term in Congress, she went to Zurich with the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom to draft a alternative to the Treaty of Versailles. And on that trip was Mary Church Terrell, who, if you don't know, was a African-American suffragist and pioneer, I think, of intersectional feminism. And despite, again, their sort of pretense of progressivism, no one on the trip, of which there were about 20 in the American contingent, would room with her, which Jeanette found to be absurd. And so Jeanette roomed with Mary. And after that trip, Jeanette became a proponent of civil rights and equal rights, and was very active in that movement. She didn't take a leadership role, but there's a gentleman whose name I forget, but he is running for governor of Georgia. He's from DeKalb County. He remembers Jeanette being the only white person who would come and talk to a segregated school in DeKalb County, Georgia in the 1950s. She marched with Coretta Scott King, of course, against the Vietnam War. And I think it's important. It was important for me to acknowledge Jeanette's evolution in thought, and that she could admit when she was wrong and dead wrong and change. And I think that's something that we all need to be able to embrace.
So the one that it seems to me, and of course you're the expert, that really cast her into almost oblivion and disrepute was the fact that she was an unwavering pacifist and refused to vote for us to enter both World War I and World War II. Even knowing what the Nazis were doing in Germany, she was the only no vote for us to enter World War II, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I would just push back, because Americans actually didn't know what was happening in Nazi Germany in 1941. It was actually, this is not what the book is about, but the Roosevelt administration was very careful to censor the press because there was such anti-Semitism in America at the time that he believed that if it was construed as a war to save the Jews, that Americans wouldn't want to go to war. And so there was very little reporting about what was going on at Germany at the time. And I don't know if she would have changed her vote if she had known. But what she did do was that she voted against the declaration of war against Japan after Pearl Harbor. And you can't imagine a moment where Americans were more unified for war than, right, December 7th, 1941. But what other biographies and sort of narratives about her missed for a variety of reasons was that she really spent the interwar years lobbying for peace and disarmament to the point of her own personal impoverishment. She lived in a small shack, a former sharecropper shack in Georgia, so she could drive to DC but still live this sort of rural life. She didn't have an indoor bathroom. She grew pecans to subsidize her meager income. And she understood very early on, right, the consequences of the military-industrial complex, well before Eisenhower was talking about it. And she knew, as she said often, if you prepare for war, you get war. If you prepare for peace, you get peace. And she was trying to help America and the world prepare for peace. And so she very much predicted, right, that the world would go to war, not because it was inevitable, not because that was human nature, but because corporations were building larger and larger war machines, and the only return on that investment would be to go to war. And we look at, right, not to freak everybody out, but you look at the largest investment in war technology right now, and it's AI. So we are again at this moment in history, right, where we can choose to go towards that path of peace or go towards that path of war, where corporations will demand their return on an investment, no matter the cost to us. And so just to finish up, because I know I've been talking for a long time, but she didn't vote against declaration of war with Japan because she believed it would change anything. She voted on it because she wanted to hang I believe, because she wanted to hang a lantern on the path that could have been if we had chosen it.
But of course, that vote and her vote not to join in World War I cost her greatly. And am I correct in saying that, I think the book references it as well, that because of that, she was absolutely alienated from the women's community,
Yes.
alienated and really sent to the basement of history because
Very
of
much
that
so.
position. And yet, to her defense, when it came time to vote for funding to help the war effort, she did support that on the theory that the quicker we can get this over with, the better for humankind.
Correct.
So it did have a tremendous impact on her, and yet she stood by her principles her whole life, didn't she?
Oh, absolutely.
So you've spent an enormous amount of time and energy learning about this extraordinary woman, her words, her actions, her thoughts, kind of got into her mind. And with that, given what is going on in our nation today, I wonder if you have any thoughts on how you think she might respond to what's happening in this world today.
You know, I will say something that I don't know if everybody wants to hear, but I'm going to say it because you asked what she would do. You know, she was alive with Nixon. And someone came to her, of course she hated Nixon, who doesn't hate Nixon? And somebody came to her house and they were just going on and on and on and on about how much they hated Nixon. And she said to them, why do you spend so much time tearing someone down? If you spent as much time tearing someone down as you did building somebody better up, we would all be in a better position. And I think she would just spend time building up the people she believed would be better leaders rather than fixating on the problem, right? We all know what the problem is. What's the solution? And I think she would be very solution oriented. And the other thing I think she would be, what she would do was to organize, right? That's all she really knew how to do, was to organize people, to get people together, to get people talking, and to get people moving together towards really a more perfect union, I would say.
So I'm going to skip a bunch because I know we've already gone over the time, but I do want to ask you, you know, do you think she would have been treated differently and her success been greater or lesser had she been a man? Did her gender hold her back in any ways, or was she able to achieve the successes that she had sought for, or that the lack of that success was not gender-based?
I think that there's two answers to that question. She was incredibly successful as a trailblazing woman, and she couldn't have achieved that were she not a woman, and I am incredibly grateful that she did that. But was she penalized also for being a woman? I guess I can express that best in one of my favorite headlines about her, written at the time of her election, which was Jeanette Rankin hunts bears and can cook. And I think it really sums up, right, these antipodes that women in politics and women in general are supposed to be able to balance, right? You're aggressive and capable of achieving things, but not too much, and you can still be domestic. And those are impossible things to balance.
Like making cookies.
Like making cookies.
So bringing again back to today, based upon all of your thorough research, is there anyone out there who best aligns, in your opinion, with her style, beliefs, commitment, and personality? Sort of a modern day Jeanette Rankin.
Everyone in this room.
That's a very good political answer. All right, last question. What's next for you? You know, are there production houses expressing any interest in making a film out of this book or the other book you wrote on Dickie? I mean, we're seeing today more women who are becoming producers, who are trying to bring women back out into the fore. Any thoughts, any opportunities here for you?
I can't talk about it.
Oh, that's very good to hear. Excellent.
So yeah.
And your next book or your next subject, is there someone out there that you're very interested in learning about, whether it's someone from the past or someone from the present?
So I'm working on 2 projects now. The first is the narrative history of Ms. Magazine, which I'm very excited about. And the second is actually a novel, and it's historical fiction. It's based on a real person by the name of Dorothy Waring, who in 1930s New York infiltrated Nazi propaganda and paramilitary circles, all while being a single Jewish mother, and brought them down. True story.
Wow. Well, I just want to end with a statement by JFK when he referenced her. Again, she lived to see him president and die. Lived until May 18th of 1973. So as you say, Nixon. JFK said to her, quote, "Few members of Congress have ever stood more alone while being true to a higher honor and loyalty." I mean, isn't that quite a statement? Do you have any other thoughts that you would add? What would you say is the Jeanette Rankin, if you could express her in a sentence or 2 sentences?
Solidarity. It's everything. I'll end with that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.